Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar that's presented by the International Society for Quality of Life Studies, better known as ISQOLS. My name is Jill Johnson, and I'm the Executive Director for ISQOLS. Very pleased to have Mark Henry with us today. We'll introduce him in a second, but I just want to give some overviews before we get into it. Just a reminder that this is a free webinar, and we are very pleased to present this free to everyone, but we will be recording this and posting the recording on our members only forum after the facts, along with some presenter details and materials. If you are not a member, I really encourage you to consider becoming a member. It's only $75 USD for an entire year, and that gets you access to our membership forum. It gives you a great discount on our upcoming ISQOLS conference, which is actually happening this August 3rd through the 6th. In the US at Vermont, University of Vermont in Burlington. We're very pleased to have you all join us. Hopefully we're just talking with Mark about the things sort of turning around in terms of post-pandemic era. So we hope that you can make time to join us in Vermont this summer. There's so many details about that on our website at isqols.org. If you're not subscribed, please do consider subscribing as well. During this webinar, we just asked that you would keep your camera off to preserve bandwidth, also stay muted. But in the meantime, if you wouldn't mind just clicking that chat bar down below and tell us your name and where you're from. We always like to hear where all of our attendees are from. I'll start. My name is Jill and I'm from Arizona in the United States. Very early here. It's lovely to see where everyone else is joining us from. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Mark. Remember that we do have a time for question and answers at the end. So please wait until the end before you ask your questions. You can also type them in the chat bar and we'll address that. Mark, do you have any other questions for me?
All good.
All good. Okay, we'll go ahead and turn it over to you. Thank you.
Wow, thanks very much, Jill. Hello, everyone. I'm Mark, exactly, and author of In Fact, an Optimist Guide to Ireland at 100. Very pleased with the opportunity to talk to you a little bit around Ireland as a case study of improvement in national well-being. I'm going to provide the evidence for that for you. Ireland in the 1920s, see Ireland at 100. 100 this year, it's 100 years for Ireland as an independent country. So we're celebrating over the course of this year, our 100th anniversary. And this footage here came to light recently, found in the basement. I love that story, right? The basement of the Chicago Academy of Sciences, from film of Ireland in the 1920s from an American who was over visiting at the time. Now, you look at that, and all you can say is we've come a long way. We've come a long way. There wasn't much to be nostalgic about 100 years ago, but now there is, because now Ireland is the second best place to live on the planet. Well, that's not just according to me, of course, that's according to the wonderful United Nations Development Programme. So yes, we're number 2 there behind Norway, joint with Switzerland in terms of quality of life. Now, many of you are familiar with this this piece of work, and I mean, hey, to be second is absolutely fantastic, but not only are we second, we've actually had greater progress than any other developed nation in the index since it started. So since 1990, when the work first began, we were 23rd. We've risen 22 places up to second there in the most recent data set. So, as I say, greater progress than any other developed nation. So as we approach the 100th anniversary, I thought I should put all this stuff down. We should record the facts about the progress that we've made, because there are remarkable achievements that I'm going to talk about across all aspects of Irish life, from the economy, culturally, socially, every element. Education in particular, I'm going to touch on. And the point is, okay, we've achieved it. I call it 100 remarkable achievements for 100 years and put the data there behind each of those. But also, well, how do we achieve that? How did we reach that point for each of the areas which I'm going to touch on in terms of progress? And how do we improve our quality of life so much faster than other places? Why are we the developed nation that's arisen above others? I'm going to touch a bit on that. And of course, we open the newspapers any day of the week. It isn't necessarily the news story that's jumping out there on page 1, 2, or 3. So it is also, I did touch in the book, I suppose, about what are the psychological biases that prevent us appreciating, that lead people to have the different view, because I'll touch on that towards the end, of course, people of all nations do have a different view that things are getting worse, when of course we know the opposite to be the case now. And in fact, an Optimist Guide to Ireland at 100 makes the case and proves the fact that we're getting so much better. So look, let's delve into it. But who am I? I studied psychology, BA, master's, research psychology many moons ago. But then went into the commercial field, worked in market research, did that for a whole variety of different places, from consultancies to tech companies, and then in tourism. As I said earlier, for those who were on the call early, spent the last 2 decades telling the good news about Ireland as a tourism destination and about its progress as a nation. So I thought, let's do that in my spare time as well as the day job. So I'm not an academic. If you guys later want to put me through the rigor of some academic questioning, that's fine. Give me a go. So look, this is me, Mark Henry. The United Nations, well, we know the sort of criteria, right, that they're looking at when they give us that number 2 ranking. You know, the buckets that are there, the factors that account for the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Index. And of course, long and healthy life is kind of like the first bucket of things that they looked at. And here's where we've seen, of course, remarkable growth, as many nations have, but, you know, average life expectancy has grown by 25 years over the last century in Ireland. So from 57 average years of lifespan back in 1926, now we're up there to 82. And as you can see, for females, obviously pushing a bit higher than that again. Only 2 years less than the most longest lived nation, the Japanese. So huge growth. I think, if I remember correctly from my own book, I think we're 16th in the world now in terms of average lifespan. It's life, but of course it's healthy life years as well. So government health spending in real terms has increased dramatically. Again, the 1970s, in real terms, the government was spending roughly €350 per man, woman, and child in the country. Now it's more than 3,500 euros in terms of investment in the public sector in health. And of course, well, that has had a benefit. In fact, the Irish are now the healthiest in Europe, at least self-appraised. Eurostat survey across all of the European nations and the UK shows that 84%, if you can read that on your screen, 84% of Irish people report good or very good health in the most recent survey, higher than any other nation. And of course, good health, good nutrition, all that leads to improving height. So the average heights of men and women today have grown significantly. Women taller by 18 centimeters than they were a century ago, men by 12.5 centimeters. So women now as tall essentially today as men were back 100 years before. So you know, good evidence of health improvement, of people obviously living longer and healthier lives, and comparatively speaking, as I say, good results in that area. But of course, education is another bucket that the UNDP looks at in terms of, okay, so people are living long, but you know, are they developed and able to contribute to society to their fullest? Well, here's where Ireland has had a very strong improvement. In fact, the UNDP say that this factor, education, that bucket, has contributed more to our growth in their rankings than any other aspect, in fact. A few examples of that: second level education. You know, in the 1960, there you can see it, 65% of people who entered secondary school completed all the way through to do their final examination. We called our leaving certificate. It was edging up to 7 and 10 in the 80s. In the 90s into 2000s, we got to hit 8 and 10. Now we have more than 9 and 10 of those who enter second level education will complete that leaving certificate. And given that includes more and more children who have special needs, for example, who may never be able to complete that degree of examination, this is clearly exceptionally strong progress. And again, stronger than many other European nations for which we've got comparative data. It's a sign of quantity of education. What about quality? Well, you know, people to teacher ratios, maybe one metric. You can see the primary level here has dropped significantly, but in secondary level 2, pupil to teacher ratios have never been more favorable, quite significant improvements. And a lot of that, in particularly primary level, in fact, with special needs teachers, to ensure in a way, as I talk about it in the book, that truly every child these days has their education needs met to some degree or other. And that certainly was not the case going back 30 or 40 years ago, where with special needs, I'm sorry, you didn't even get an education. So good improvements in terms of pupil teacher ratios at second level. Perhaps the most significant change, the most meaningful change, has actually been at third level, tertiary education, where we've had huge growth. So the graph shows the percentage of the adult population that has completed a higher education qualification. So I did my BA in psychology in the early 90s. So you had 13% there, 1990, of the adult population with a higher education qualification. It is now, as you can see, more than half. And that's more than half have actually completed higher level education. If you think about it, of course, that means that in the last 20 to 30 years, the numbers coming through have to be well above 50% in order to get that degree of change. In fact, the numbers you can see has doubled in just 2 decades. So hugely populated education, one of the world's most highly educated, the most highly educated in Europe in terms of people with third level qualifications. So if you go back to the UN, that's kind of the second bucket, right? This huge improvement in terms of quality of education, people's ability to contribute to society. Okay, have they got the income? Then I suppose is kind of their third bucket. And here's where, you know, Ireland's story in particular is so significant, because in truth, although I'm looking at a full century worth of change and data where I've got it, and this is a lucky graph because it does have 100 years, the point is that a lot of that change has happened really in the last 4 or 5 decades, not in the first half of that century. So you can see here GDP per capita in constant terms, and how Ireland lagged the UK. Obviously, we separated from the UK 100 years ago and started from behind and didn't catch up for a very long time, as you can see, although there were some improvements, of course, in absolute GDP terms, but no closing of the gap up until really the 1990s. You can see it there as we had a huge economic boom in the 1990s. I'll touch on that a little bit again. We rapidly surpassed the UK in GDP per capita, and then touched up at US levels. And as you can see, in the last couple of years have even surpassed the United States in terms of GDP per capita. So this speaks to the huge improvements in that third area, I suppose, of economic development. There's a lot going on in this, and you know, I'm going to touch on and unpack a bit of it now, a little bit. But you know, one of the things I think we can be proud of. So when you look at GDP per hour worked, Ireland, Irish people are the most productive in the world. I like that figure. Now, a lot of economists here are jumping straight out of their chairs, because of course GDP for us as a calculation includes multinational sector, and Ireland success in particular has been down to its ability to attract foreign direct investment. A lot of that has resulted in us. The headquarters of Meta and Facebook are here now. The headquarters of LinkedIn, the headquarters of Twitter for Europe are based in Ireland. Accenture is now an Irish company. You know, many companies have either moved their headquarters, or at least their European headquarters, to Ireland. And that does play with the data a little bit. So I'm going to unpack that somewhat. But hey, let's take it for this one. That's something to be proud of, right? Most productive country in the world 100 years on. I think we'll take it. And you know, that's per hour worked. Of course, we're even working less hours for all of that. 20% fewer hours than the last generation. And you can see how 1978, for example, 48 hours a week was the average that the average employee worked. In the 1990s, the European Union, introduced legislation that limited the working week to 48 hours. That was the maximum. So that helped, of course, contribute to that decline. You know, and it actually is a lot more to do with those who worked, let's say, full-time, 5 days a week, and reducing their hours that has contributed to this reduction. More so the introduction of part-time work, actually. But overall, we're working fewer hours than the last generation, so that's all good. But importantly, more people have jobs than ever before. You see, so this is why I go back to that graph of GDP per capita. So you might say, oh, it took a huge takeoff there in the 90s, 2000s, and all that's fantastic, but that's due to all those multinationals coming in. Yeah, it is, and including those figures in Irish GDP, because they're claiming all their European profits in Ireland. Yeah, that's true. But that's nevertheless translated into a huge growth in employment. So I have this data all the way back to the 1920s. It's pretty depressing to go all the way back, because there was only just over a million, 1.1 million people employed in the country in the 20s and the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. So only as we began to see that economic growth strongly in the 90s and into the 2000s did that number, for the first time, significantly take off, doubled, as you see, to 2.2 million there by 2007. Bit of a great recession. We were hit hard by that, but by 2019, we'd exceeded those levels again. And indeed, the latest figures out last week show that at the end of last year, we now had hit 2.5 million people in employment, a higher figure than we've ever had before. So there have been real benefits, economically speaking, for that, and not just the fact there are more people in jobs, but the very nature of those jobs has changed. So the percentage in high, medium, and low skill jobs, point being, I suppose, if you look at the high on the left, the 1980s was the smallest slice of the pie. Now it's the biggest slice of the pie. So a huge amount of those jobs now in high skilled areas. That opportunity that was created in terms of employment opportunities obviously brought women in particular into the workforce in a way that just wasn't the case before. I talk about the big crossover there, X marks the spot in 1996, when for the first time more women were in the labour force than full-time at home looking after home duties or family. So quite a revolution there in terms of women's engagement. And again, comparatively, we were coming from behind other places there in Europe, undoubtedly, but have now reached a point where we're well up or even exceeding many other countries. All of that has translated into increases in real earnings. So the real industrial wage, where we have data going right back there to 1940s, we've seen that fantastic growth. So a five-fold increase in the average industrial wage in real terms, and it continues to increase. So unlike other countries, we are not experiencing stagnation in real wages. They continue to increase as that profile of jobs changes, more jobs and more of them high skilled. And in fact, importantly, I suppose, income inequality is decreasing. So income inequality measured by the Gini coefficient in 2019 was at the lowest level on record. So of course the data doesn't go back hugely, but nevertheless what we've got does suggest a downward trend. And in fact, not just a downward trend for us, but in fact, when you can look at it comparatively speaking, a relatively equal society. So it's looking at income inequality. You've got the Gini coefficients there for the US, the UK, and a little bit there, a little bit lower down, the EU average, 30.2, we're at 28.8. Still not there in terms of, let's say, some of the Nordic countries, Denmark or Norway, but that's now the set of other countries that we're in alongside. And so many of these measures now, the Nordic countries, rather than, for example, the United Kingdom, which of course would have been, as I said, gaining independence from 100 years ago. Really the century, its journey has been one of moving away from the UK in so many areas of Irish life and aligning ourselves more with the Nordic set of countries. So income inequality decreasing, no surprise then. In fact, if you think about it, that the middle class or middle income bracket is what's growing significantly. That's what's shown in the blue there. In fact, those on lower incomes and those on upper incomes have decreased, which of course makes sense as income inequality is decreasing while overall incomes are going up. So what really accounted for that significant uptick in all of those economic variables was an export-driven expansion. So this graph, which shows the value of goods exported, it nearly maps on. I mean, it correlates nearly perfectly with that earlier graph showing GDP per capita, because our exports, and look at that line, it's zero effectively. We're exporting really nothing before the 1970s, predominantly agriculture, predominantly live cattle on boats to Britain and elsewhere. That was what we were doing. We were already finishing, dare I say, the product here, and we were just shipping it off for others to do that. But then began this huge growth in goods exports. It stalled a little bit, in fact, before the Great Recession due to the unavailability of staff. So the jobs that were created, there weren't enough people here, which I'll come to in a minute. But now, of course, we've seen that continue to accelerate. And although this is goods exported, when you actually look at services, which the growth has been predominantly in the last 20 years, it now exceeds the value of goods exported in all the more. So huge growth in exports, and that is what has delivered the financial means to be able to deliver some of what we've seen, because we are amongst the best in the world at attracting foreign investment. Somebody I can hear isn't on mute, just to say, if you don't mind. So this is the average number of jobs created through foreign investment for every million residents per year. Looking over the last 10 years, the IBM Institute of Business Value have looked at it. And as you can see, Ireland there second in terms of the average number of jobs created by FDI per million residents. But that's the volume. When they actually look at it by value, Ireland is the #1 in terms of the high value jobs that it's created every year since they began measuring this more than 10 years ago. So very successful in attracting foreign investment. That's delivering exports, fantastic, but we're turning it in to high quality jobs, as we've seen. But we can't get all the labor internally. I go back to that point. We had a crunch there, in the mid 2000s. We didn't have enough people coming into the country. So Ireland flipped, and that story of growth is one of flipping from being a country which was really an emigrant country, where the population was growing up to emigrate. In the 1950s, for example, more than a third, I think, I don't remember figures, I think it was nearly 4 in 10 of all people aged 20 and 30 in their 20s and 30s left the country. In the 1950s, huge emigration. You see, there was no growth in employment. Population was growing, but there was no jobs. So people left. Now we have utterly turned that on its head, because, of course, now to feed that growth, to create those jobs, we can't have children fast enough, right? So, of course, it's immigration now is a major source of Ireland's success story. This shows, of course, the percentage of population born outside of Ireland. 1950s, what was that, 3%? Now it's nearly 1 in 5. So nearly 1 in 5 people who are resident here today weren't born here. So a wonderful success story in terms of opening ourselves up and providing the talent that we needed to have that growth. So, how are people feeling about the country? Given all of those improvements, all those buckets, all those indicators that the UN are looking at, we're ticking all the boxes. Well, satisfaction with democracy in Ireland is very high. It goes up and down depending on economic circumstances, but even at the worst of times, you can basically see satisfaction nearly always exceeded 50%. At the current level, more than 8 in 10 people say they're satisfied with the state of democracy in Ireland. And in fact, again, some work was done by Oxford University, if I recall correctly, referred to in the book, last year or the year before last, and we're one of only a handful of nations, I think it's 7, 8, who've seen satisfaction with democracy increase over the last few decades, when a lot of democracies, of course, are going through crises of confidence in a way with their democracy. Does all that lead people to be happy? Well, the evidence is yes. Percentage of people who say they are very or fairly satisfied with their life in European Commission surveys. I've been tracking this since we joined the EU in the 1970s. Highest ever levels there. They're annualized figures. So, we've got hitting 95% of people satisfied with their lives. In the most recent question specifically about happiness, which was 2017, in the EU, 97% of Irish people, 97%, said they described themselves as happy with their lives. Only 1% said they were unhappy with their quality of life. So overall, fantastic improvements. And again, that we were on that EU survey of happiness, the happiest nation in the EU, #1, compared to the 26 other nations that were there at that point in time. So I did some analysis in the book, having profiled, I suppose, these huge improvements, 100 different areas. Obviously, I know what I've touched on there, 30 maybe. There's a lot more, so hey, read the book. But when you look then, okay, say, right, well, what are the factors that contribute to happiness? And literature review here, so dipping into the work of Veenhoven, of Diner, of the World Happiness Report, stuff from the Journal of Happiness. The point is, I suppose, more and more there's work there that says, well, what makes a population happy? Plenty of work, of course, what makes a person happy, but digging out, well, what would make the population happy? Because that's what we're seeing in Ireland. And again, you look through the list here, and I'll touch on it, but all these things are things that Ireland has evidenced. Economic development, well, clearly. Globalization, yeah, sure, that's what those exports are all about. Level of democracy, we're a high level. So I cite several studies to that effect. Rule of law, absence of corruption. Again, we're in the top 20 least corrupt countries in the world. Good governance, yes. Political stability, certainly. I'll touch on that in a minute. Progressive tax regime, we do. Adequate income security, yes. Good healthcare system, yeah. Talked about government investment in that. Healthy natural environment, yeah. We're fortunate enough to live in a relatively unindustrialized country, obviously on an island, on a green island indeed. Urbanization, yeah, I haven't touched on it here, but obviously been a strong shift towards urbanization. We've gone from 2/3 living in rural environments 100 years ago to now 2/3 in urban environments. High level of trust in community, yeah, going to come to that. Personal political freedom, yeah, the most recent Global Freedom Index, we were rated 5th. It was only released there a month ago. A flourishing society, yeah, the evidence is there. So we see all of those things, and I haven't just selected the ones that done well on, are areas that Ireland has done particularly well on. I suppose the point is, you could take the list on the right, I'm not going to talk so much about it, right? What makes a person happy? And you can map that on to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But I suppose I was thinking, well, you could do the same with the list on the left. And in effect, what that gives you is a blueprint for national well-being, because these are the factors that are coming to the fore in the research at the moment that say these are the things that can deliver high levels of national well-being. So the same factors you saw on the left, but just categorized according to Maslow's hierarchy. So obviously at the bottom, the core physiological needs, that's where your economic development comes in. That's where your adequate income security, etc., good healthcare system, your safety, well, you're talking about the rule of law, aren't you? The absence of corruption, good governance, love and belonging, well, is right, but the trust in the community, but also the urbanization. It's easier to find love in a city, right? The esteem, levels of democracy, personal political freedom, that people are free to express themselves and feel esteemed for that. Cognitive needs, greater education, obviously, pursuit of leisure, self-actualization. Well, that's where you get to the progressive tax regime and a sense of personal meaningfulness. So there is a bit of a blueprint, I think, forming for national well-being, and Ireland is an exemplar of that. But okay, why specifically has Ireland done better, than other nations? What has enabled its success? And I suppose in the book I've diagnosed, well, for each of the areas, I looked at those 100 points. Interviewed experts in each of them to say, well, so what's the story about underlying our educational progress, underlining our export growth, underlining our, healthier lifespan? And so there's a lot of expert testimony in there. I suppose the point is, when you look at all that, what are the commonalities of what underpins that? 4 factors came to the fore that I suppose, account for that growth of well-being represented by the green plant over the period. So, firstly, I call out our stability. And Ireland has been fortunate, of course, in one sense, geographically, perhaps because we are right off the west coast. We were spared from the Second World War in effect. So we have had a stable 100 years of unbroken democracy. So we're one of only a dozen countries that have achieved 100 years of unbroken democratic. Ireland has avoided the swings to far left or far right, or even just to hard left or hard right. We don't have a strong communist party. We don't have a strong right party. We have very centrist political parties. It's nearly a product of the reason behind our formation as a country. There was a divide over whether Ireland should form an independent nation while leaving 6 counties behind to form Northern Ireland. That's the route we went down, but that was the basis on which politics diverged around the nature of the state, not actually around policy. And there's a huge amount of consistent policy approach applied over that period. So when the investment in attracting export-led growth, the attraction, investment, education, all those policies were continued stably, if you like, irrespective of government over that period, which to me gives a huge wealth of institutional capital. So we built up a good reservoir of institutional capital, one factor. Second one I call out is community. So we've got very high levels of interpersonal trust, comparatively speaking. We've got a good sense of fairness. Our upper class left when the country was formed. So we don't have a strong them and us in what is a relatively small country. The politicians are elected through proportional representation. So for any one area, there might be 3, 4, 5 public representatives, and they tend to be very much coming from the people. We have taken there's public funding of political office. So, you cannot raise funds from the commercial sector or any significant donations. So all that has led to politicians who are quite close to the community. And don't forget, as our economic wealth has grown, so inequality has decreased. Evidence, I argue, of strong social capital. Then I suppose the third thing is education. So if you had, the stability of community being good fertile soil for the country, well, then you put on the superpowered water from education. Obviously, I've talked about that huge growth. We were a little bit late to the game, but that massive investment to the point where now we have one of the most highly educated populations on the planet, obviously allows the country to develop to its fullest potential. And then, and that, I suppose, gives us human capital into the mix. But then, of course, we have opened ourselves up to the world. And I talk about, I've talked about how the first 50 years, well, there wasn't much to shout about. First 50 years, Ireland really pursued a policy of self-sufficiency, which didn't work out. And then it's next year that we will celebrate our 50th anniversary of joining the European Union, or the EEC as it was, the European Economic Community, in 1973. Now, that really was an exemplar of our switch away from the failed policy of self-dependence towards openness to the world. And when you are where we are, it's very hard actually for policymakers to look beyond Britain. I mean, literally, you have to kind of get over Britain to look into the continental Europe. And it was really joining the EEC, joining the European Union, that really opened our minds policy-wise, that opened us in terms of labor markets, that opened ourselves in terms of being able to sell exports into the European Union. And that, of course, is what has attracted all that foreign direct investment, the ability to base themselves in Ireland and to sell into the European Union. So that openness has paid huge dividends. So you also think of it in terms of openness of labor supply, so being able to bring in the talent that we needed with the languages that we needed from anywhere in Europe as freedom of movement is, of course, a key principle of EU membership. So 4 factors that have enabled Ireland's success, and for me, have explained that proportionally greater performance, a comparatively greater performance in recent decades. Human capital, institutional capital, social capital, and openness. Now, of course, most people nevertheless think the world is getting worse. And it's true of Ireland, really, as it is elsewhere. I don't have good data for Ireland in this one, but here's a study I refer to in the book from 2015, generally thinking about the world, all things considered. Is it getting better or worse? And, China aside, as you can see, everywhere, people, the average population samples here, are saying things are getting worse. I mean, overwhelming. Look, 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10 in France saying things are getting worse. And yet, objectively, we know that isn't the case. Of course, that's what's out to prove for Ireland, in fact. But why do people believe that? So I have a chapter in the book pulling on the psychology as to why it's hard to believe. And I pick on what I perceive to be the 5 biggest biases that prevent us appreciating the positive progress that we're making. And these are true of Ireland, because I say you open the newspaper, switch on the TV, you don't get, it's another great day. Of course, you're reading the challenges that face everyday life, but that's also true, of course, elsewhere. So what are the 5 biases? And for time, I'm not planning to go into them in any depth, but we can revisit them if we want in the chat. You're programmed to hear bad news, right? So, of course, the negativity bias to start with. So overall, of course, as human beings, we pay more attention to bad news. Now, I'm sure many of you are a lot more familiar with this than even I am. But, I talk in the book about some great studies that have been done in this area, were presented with, an even choice on websites of good and bad news. People will inevitably go towards the bad, which, of course, leads us to believe that things are getting worse, when in fact we are not paying proportionate attention similarly to the good news. Second one I talk about is that good stuff takes time and bad stuff happens quickly. And I'm thinking here, I talk about it in terms of the analogy of the frog in the pot, right? So you put the frog in the cold water and you turn on the heat, and gradually it boils. The frog doesn't notice, and it boils to death. Now, of course, that is an analogy and is not true. The frog jumps out of the pot every time, but there is science behind the logic of this, which is that as human beings, we are quite bad at identifying the time change. We're quite bad at identifying change. Of course, it's an analogy of negative change, in the sense that, oh God, we don't recognize the negative stuff that happens gradually around us. But of course, in this context, the opposite is true, as in we don't notice the good stuff that's happening around us. We don't have an attention span that's designed for a 100-year or a 50-year period. We don't even, I've got evidence in the book that in fact we have an attention span of 5 years. We can touch on that if we like. But I've therefore labeled this progress attention deficit. We have an attention deficit when it comes to positive progress equally. And of course, that means we don't appreciate what is slowly happening, but long-term improvements. Thirdly, everything seemed better when you were younger. Yes, for psychologists, a well-proven reminiscence bump. which is that, yeah, later in life, when you look back, you are better at remembering the positive life events that happened in your 20s. In fact, talk about a great study, it even shows that Americans are better at remembering the Oscar winners when they're in their 20s. As opposed to the ones that were in their 40s or 50s or 60s. So we remember those good things that were happening back then. That leads us to a bit of declinism. We can think that things are getting worse because nowadays we've got this health problem and the kids and that. So things can lead us to think things are getting worse. And of course, that's not the case. We're extrapolating from a bias that it affects to us personally, to society as a whole. But more interesting work done in Harvard in the last years talked about prevalence-induced concept change. In other words, an improving world makes you more of a critic. In other words, as the problems in the world become less frequent, you are more likely to see them. You are more likely to spot poverty nowadays than you were when it was far more prevalent 50 years or at extreme 100 years ago. And there's some great work on this showing how, as I say, the more improvements we make, the more likely you are to see problems rather than to appreciate it, because of course they're standing out more, because they're more of an exception. And you change your definition of what a problem is to encompass more of this stuff, even though it's less frequent. And last but not least, I talk in the book about the illusory truth effect. If you're misled, often enough you'll come to believe it. But the problem here is that people, if you tend to believe things because you hear them said, if you hear something said, even if it's fake news, you are more inclined to believe it the second time you hear it, simply because you've heard it again. It's a fluency bias. In other words, your brain goes, yeah, I've heard that before, that's true, without analyzing it. So if you don't switch on your rational capabilities, you can be misled simply because enough people are saying things enough times, you begin to think it must be true. And of course, in the world of politics, in the current environment, that's very tricky, because of course, lots of people on the opposition, the way our democracy is set up, say, oh yeah, things could be much better. Things are terrible. We've got a crisis of housing, a crisis of cost of living, a crisis of employment, unemployment. We're losing jobs. There's a negative mantra that leads you and your brain to believe that those things must be true. I'm talking about them all the time. They must be true. And yet, objectively, I've not to deny, of course, there's an element of truth and things that need to improve. But overall, you're misled to believe things must be in crisis, things must be getting worse, when in fact, the opposite is true. Of course, we always have crises all the time to address. So I'm going to skip through, each of these areas, plenty in the book, and we can revisit them if you want to, just each of those biases and some of the great work that's been done on them. But, of course, there is an element of truth in all of that. Of course, we don't live in a utopia. Of course, Ireland is not a utopia either. It's just that we happen to be second best quality of life in the world. Many people here don't believe it, of course, and go, what, are you kidding me? Which has been part of the success of the book, because the objective of it, to challenge that thinking, to explain why they might believe that. But it's not to deny the reality. I have a chapter at the end of the book that talks about, look, of course we've challenges we enter into our century ahead. I mean, all that growth we talked about in economic terms, that economic capital that has come somewhat at an expense of natural capital, right? We weren't really thinking about the economic impact of some of this stuff 50 years ago. So Ireland now, yes, is one of the world's worst contributors to climate change, at least on a per capita basis. So on the graph, it's showing the EU, the best three and the worst three. We're there, the worst performers in terms of per capita CO2 emissions. So a lot to do there. And I mean, it's great that we have high incomes and high income jobs, but of course, that demand, supply and demand, that pushes up prices. So we are, in fact, also one of the most expensive places to live relative to the EU average. We're second only to Denmark and up there with Luxembourg, right, in terms of the cost of living in Ireland. If you were to ask Irish people what the number one challenge is today, they'd say we haven't got enough homes for people because of that economic crash. We're building huge number of homes. You can see that huge growth there. We had more 90,000 homes being built every year, but then we had this economic crash, and all of a sudden there were no homes we built. But of course, that didn't stop people having babies and those babies becoming adults and still needing a home. I talked about all that immigration we needed to feed that economic growth, and how we've now reached record 2.5 million people in jobs, a lot of that through immigration, but we're not building enough houses to house all these people. So we've got 20,000 or so built in 2020 and again last year. But depending on the figures you're looking at, there's anything between 35 and 50,000 needed just to meet the annual demand. So that's causing a real challenge. And to me, what that is creating a group of people now in their 20s and 30s saying, we can't get a house, we can't afford it. And that's a real problem because, of course, go back to that community that we have, and this potentially begins to break that apart a bit. You've got a generation to say, well, they're doing fine, but I'm not, and I generation are not. So one, of course, that policymakers are seeking to address. But also, very importantly, third level education funding has halved, at least half per capita. Because what happened was we had the economic crash in 2008. The government reduced investment in third level education at that point, but the population kept growing, and so the number of students kept growing, because you've seen the participation rates and how they've shot up and continue to remain really, really high. So we've got a huge number of students going through third level education, but the government funding per student is now well below what it was, and that is obviously has a long-term impact on the quality of that education if we don't right that wrong. So some challenges, of course, as we head into the century ahead. It's not perfect, but look, to finish, what can we learn from Ireland's journey to well-being? Because I think it is a great case study of success. What I've tried to do in the book is to say, look, we need to reflect factfully on what Ireland has achieved and how it achieved it. And for each of those 100 things, as I say, I've talked to people about experts, and those who played their role in helping that change happen, and talk to them about why, how do we achieve that? What policies, what initiatives are put in place that made this come to pass? And a lot of those have relevance for other places. Investing in the factors that contributed to the success. So I've talked about the 4 factors that underpinned Ireland's success, developing institutional capital, social capital, human capital, of course, and our openness. Those are, the evidence is there increasingly to say that investing in those will benefit all countries, all localities. Applying the blueprint for national well-being. Well, we've seen it there in terms of that Maslow's hierarchy, of course, is based on the work that so many good folks are doing and identifying those factors that contribute to national well-being. So we now know what they are. So beginning to apply that blueprint enables people to improve national levels of well-being. But of course, measuring and targeting progress. So I know some folks like Dinah were talking about this for quite some time. Ireland has finally now begun under this government, new government, to put in place a well-being framework. So they've identified well-being indicators, and the National Statistics Agency is beginning to track those for the first time, consistent or coherently measuring the contributions to well-being, and of course beginning to put in place then targets for improvements around them, which of course is essential if we want to see progress in those contributing factors. But ultimately, it is about spreading the good word, because as we know, there are real improvements in well-being and things that can be done more to improve well-being. But that's not the impression the general public often has, as I've talked about. So, I think we all have a responsibility to spread the good word, about Ireland's progress, but about global progress. Obviously, so much has been done in the last 10 or 20 years, despite the challenges that we read about in the day-to-day newspapers. We've all, I think, got a role to play here in spreading the good word and giving people the context and actually the realistic understanding, the factful understanding of where we are as a people today on the planet and what we've achieved. So look, that's me. Buy your copy online, please. Get on Amazon anywhere around the world, or maybe your favorite bookstore, and learn about what Ireland has success has been, and what can be applied to you wherever you may live around the world. So look, hope that's useful. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm happy to take any questions or engage in the chat or any critiques too. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Mark. That was a wonderful presentation. Excellent insight. Really, really appreciated hearing all of those details. Thank you. We certainly do have time for questions at this point. So if you have a question, feel free to either raise your hand and we'll call on you to talk, or you can feel free to also write your question in the chat bar. Kelsey, I see that you're here with us. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, you can show your video or.
Yes, hello, Jill and Mark. Very interesting topic. It's not so often that we see success stories. Very frequently, people focus on the negative examples. So I'm quite curious what you think. So just a speculation as to why Ireland didn't have, rising income inequality, and to provide a potential mechanism. In a lot of countries, we saw, with the decline in manufacturing due to globalization, technological change, we saw the blue collar workers lose their jobs, and a lot of times have difficulty finding new ones. And this partially contributed to, the rise in income inequality. what did Ireland do differently? Can you say, because it really does seem to be a unique case here where they were able to capture the benefits of growth when other countries were unable to?
That's great. I mean, I think there are two factors. So one, you talk about, of course, the loss of industrial jobs. Well, for better or for worse, we never got industrialized. So for better or for worse, Ireland as an island, our industrial centre was Belfast. So Belfast in the north, the second city, was the industrial city. It was a shipbuilding. They built the Titanic. But when Ireland was created 100 years ago this year, Northern Ireland was created because the majority of people at that part of the island wanted to stay part of the United Kingdom. So hence we had the split, and what was left in the Republic, which was the majority of the country, but was more reliant on an agricultural economy. So we never had those industrial jobs that were lost. First point. I suppose secondly, for those people, for better or for worse, who couldn't find employment, and I point out that right up to the 50s and beyond, that was a huge problem. Emigration was the answer. So for better or for worse, they didn't stay. Those people left. And of course, again, from Irish history, we had our potato famine in the 1840s, and that, 1 million people out of 8 million at the time died, but 1 million people emigrated, and that set a huge tradition that continued all the way through, because of course then there were Irish communities in the States and Canada, Britain, elsewhere, that people could then go to for work. They had cousins, they had relations, friends, and so that was a pressure valve probably that let Ireland off the hook for quite some time. But I suppose most of the growth really came from the 70s. Obviously, that's when we had the economic growth, and why did that get distributed more fairly, perhaps than elsewhere? I think I put it down to the point I talk about community, the social capital. So it's a country of 5 million people. It's not huge. There wasn't a them and us because there wasn't really an elite. There wasn't that much money to go around in the first place. And the point was the elite had left with the United Kingdom. So there wasn't really a huge amount of wealth. The proportional representation electoral system meant that the politicians were elected, from really within the people. There wasn't a lot of money in terms of financing politicians. So all of that meant that the policymakers were quite close and to the people and to their problems. And I think overall, this desire for fairness, this desire to see all boats rise together, to desire to, it's a small enough society where you all know somebody in the family who's done well or who hasn't done well. And the desire for everyone to grow together, I think, is still there. I mean, our policymakers really still have a policy of fairness in their narrative. It's still a big topic. Equality, inequality is a big topic in politics, even though it's reducing. It still gets a huge focus, and there's a strong desire to put in place social supports for those people who don't have the incomes to support themselves. So that fairness mindset, if I haven't been on too long, I think is critical in ensuring that when the wealth comes in, there is support for the political class to redistribute it to those who need it most.
Yeah, thank you. That's makes sense to me. I have maybe some follow-up questions, but I can let somebody else go if they have questions first.
Kelsey, are there any other questions? I see some just comments in the chat bar, but no questions.
The floor is yours, Kelsey, I think.
Yeah, go ahead, Kelsey.
So very interesting. So I think that, the income inequality or the preference for equality is quite interesting. And if I may, just to take it back a step, to summarize, you had a country that was at a low level of economic sophistication, let's say. And then you all wanted to grow together, partially because of this preference for fairness. And I wonder if, there's this in-group, out-group sort of dynamic tribalism, where the Irish people kind of pitted themselves a bit against the English. And so they felt like one big group. And so maybe there's a little bit of preference for fairness within Ireland to support each other. So if that makes any sense. And then if you could also maybe speak to any specific policies. So I recognize what you said broadly, but if there's something specific you can point towards, that would be really helpful to, let's say, analyze in a more, let's say, rigorous fashion.
Yeah. No, your point about in-group, and it's certainly. I think this is a factor. I think that that the nation is small enough, and you see, I talk elsewhere in the book, about equality of opportunity. So again, in EU surveys, we're number one in terms of saying that there is far more equality of opportunity now than there was 30 years ago. So if I remember correctly, it's 8 in 10 people saying that in Ireland more than anywhere else in the EU. So people saw that equality of opportunity, and so those jobs were relatively fairly distributed. Do you know that anybody could get the education, that the education is state subsidized? There isn't a significant private sector third level, for example. It's nearly all state run, which has meant that that was accessible, relatively speaking, to everybody, and gave good equality of opportunity for those jobs as they were created to all sectors. So I suppose that's a factor as well. But and I suppose maybe that's perhaps tying into your second point in terms of policy initiatives. The openness of third level education, the desire to make it as affordable as possible. At one point in the 1990s, third level fees were abolished altogether, and I wouldn't say they were a significant barrier. In truth, people don't really have to take out loans, for example, to attend higher level education in Ireland. But going back to your in-group, out-group, certainly. I think in my lifetime, one of the transitions we've seen is the chip on the shoulder versus the United Kingdom has probably disappeared. So in other words, there was a lot of I wouldn't friendly rivalry. Do you know what I mean? Ireland always wants to beat England in the rugby or the soccer or whatever sport it happens to be, and there was always there was always a bit of the. I wouldn't even go so far, honestly, to say anti-English sentiment or anti-British sentiment, because it wasn't really that. But there was a bit of the bigger neighbor is there. Yeah,
Underdog.
Exactly, the underdog. And in truth, now that's no longer valid. And there's a generation growing up who just doesn't really make sense anymore. They don't see that. And of course, whatever your political view might be about Brexit, there's a sense that Britain has been going down an unhealthy path, really, economically and opportunity wise over the last few years. So people don't have any nostalgic sense that actually that's a better place to be. So I do think that probably was a factor, is kind of what I'm saying, but it is less so perhaps now. Not sure if I answered all the questions, but I
go ahead. You did, and then I have another one. Is if there's it's the time. So I'm wondering if this was a nice happy accident, and I understand so a lot of the growth occurred in the 1970s. The world was changing at the same time, and Ireland received a significant amount of development funding from the EU. You also had, as you said, a fairly equal society who had a preference for fairness to begin with. So now would it be possible for Ireland to continue this trajectory? And is it possible, similarly, for another country to implement what Ireland did? Or is it really too Irish specific?
Yeah, no, there's lots in that. I mean, so you're absolutely right. In the book, again, more time than we have here, to explore the benefit of joining the EU. I talked about the openness of it, but very practically, as you say, there were infrastructural development funds, which we received a lot of in the 1980s in particular. And that helped develop the infrastructure in Ireland quite significantly. I talk in the book, I consider it an achievement that we've gone from having this huge growth over the 70s and 80s in income from the EU to then in the 90s and 2000s reducing, and now we're a net contributor to the EU because of our economic success, which I think is a good thing, because now we're helping obviously other nations follow in the same path, and they're getting our investment in their investment infrastructure. So there's a whole story there that definitely is part of it. But again, when other states, particularly what are now Eastern European states, joined the EU, a lot of those were sent over to Ireland by the European Commission to look at how Ireland spent that money in terms of improving infrastructure and improving investment in productive economic development. So there undoubtedly was a positive there, but also how we deployed it was positive, which I think goes back to some of the factors in terms of the recognition of what would deliver improvements in economic well-being. I lost your thought a little bit. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, I'm trying to keep it all straight in my own head.
You did talk about going forward. Sorry.
Yeah,
sorry.
Yeah.
And I do touch on that in the book that the up and coming generation, however, can't to say that gross generalization, can't expect, of course, to see the same degree of improvement again, because of course when you're second, the challenge is to hold second position in the world. You're never going to be number one, right? So just to hold realistically a top 10 is the challenge, and partly, if I might say, why I wrote the book as well, to say, look, let's understand the factors that have contributed to our success. I'm talking there about those 4 factors, because they need to be nurtured and supported as we gone forward, and we shouldn't become complacent about any of that. And I argue we need to add that whole natural capital into the mix as well, because we're not even thinking about that properly. And although I have a chapter about progress we've made in the environmental terms, there's still, of course, a long way to go. So I mean, to me, those are the factors that will deliver success. We just need to moderate our expectations of what success might look like, because we can't go up another 22 places in the Human Development Index over the next few years, obviously.
Yeah, that answers my question. I have the feeling that you have one potential negative trend, which you described, if I understood you correctly, which is there's less support now for education, the tertiary level of education, than there was 15 years ago, and due to the crisis. And my guess is that was a major component in your ability as Ireland to capitalize on the development opportunities, and also relatively equal access in terms of quality as well. Not just access to school, but access to similar levels of quality. If you lose that, there's a potential problem there. We don't study this enough, I think, as well-being researchers, because it's difficult, and it's often the impact of education affects health and marriage rates. It also affects income. So to disentangle them is quite difficult. But I have the feeling that it's one of the major contributors to your success story.
Yeah. No, completely agree. Calling it out the book as a warning. You know what I mean? Because I mean, I get it. The participation rates have grown and grown. We've now reached a point where, if I remember correctly, it's just short of 7 in 10 of all students leaving second level now go straight into a third level course. So I mean, that's a huge expense for the government as the numbers are growing and all that sort of thing. And they were hoping that institutions might pivot perhaps slightly more towards the US model or an economic model which saw the private sector pick up a bit of that. But we're not that big a country. That hasn't happened. There was a lot of inflow of international students that certainly helped fund education here, because of course when they're beyond the EU we can charge very high fees. But on the other hand, a lot of those were from China. Of course, that has fallen away in the pandemic a bit. And in truth, it may be necessary, but it's not a sufficient funding model for the third level sector. So there's a report due on the sustainable funding models for third level at some point in the year ahead. I see, Paula, you had a question there as well. Sorry, would you say spirituality plays into the quality of life? It's an interesting one, because Ireland, of course, has a reputation as being a Catholic country, and of course it very much was for a long time. But again, part of Ireland's journey, I would say, over the last 30 years, maybe even over the last 20, has been to leave that behind in terms of connection to the church in a formal way. So the church had its scandals, child abuse scandals, in particular, moved people away from affiliating to the church or believing the church should have any say in terms of morality and social life. I talk about how we have moved from position in the 1980s and even into the early 1990s, when 2/3 of people opposed divorce, opposed abortion, certainly opposed gay rights in any way. And yet we've now moved 2/3 the other way. So 2/3, 2/3 in a poll only 6 years ago supported the introduction of gay marriage, and that was the first country in the world by public plebiscite to support the introduction of gay marriage. So we've gone through that. A lot of that has been about leaving the church values behind. Now, I know your point, spirituality isn't, of course, about organized religion. So I would say, you know, and it is a fair point that even though people no longer feel the need, for example, to go to church every week, of course, you know, the numbers going into the priesthood have fallen away dramatically. The numbers who are attending church have fallen dramatically. But, you know, you'd still be hard pushed to find a family who don't get their kids to go through communion or confirmation. And although it's growing, the vast majority of marriages still take place in the church. So there still is that desire, I suppose, the evidence that there is a spirituality that underlies that people are a little bit more reluctant to let go of, even if I would say the divorce from formal religion has been pretty quick, actually, and pretty stark, if that's any help on to answering the question. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, because I connected with your presentation maybe a little bit late, and I missed the first part of your presentation. And I would like to ask you, which are the scientific foundations of your study of Ireland? I mean, for example, there is a body of economic theory economic theory quite developed of economic development. Also, there is a body of a great body of research on the importance of culture or economic development. And in the particular case of Ireland, and especially there is a well-developed body of influence in economic development of importance of institutions, especially political and economic institutions. Yes. And in the particular case of Ireland, sorry, maybe because probably I lost part of your presentation. I would like to say, for example, importance of political institutions, especially because political institutions are very important in economic development. It's not the same if there is a government right-oriented that respects private property, that a government left-oriented or a communist government that is one important issue. In the particular case of Ireland, I would like to know your gut feeling after studying the case carefully, which in your gut feeling, which are the main, or if you have to say 2 or 3 factors, which are the main factors that have led Ireland to this excellent position that particular Ireland has now?
Yeah, no, very good. And I mean, I think your point, you see, about institutions of state, to me, I'm putting that under the banner of institutional capital, because I think absolutely, you know, we have had 100 years of unbroken democracy.
Institutions are the rules of the game, you know.
Yes. Yes.
That it depends on the political coalition or political party that's in power that impose a kind of rules or a different kind of rules. This is very important. This is one of the key issues for economic development.
Yeah, you see, and I think we have been fortunate in having quite a stable policy direction. I would say that genuinely, as we changed governments, you'd be hard pushed to identify what changes in policy took place over the decades. You know, we haven't had a very strong left or a very strong right. In the main, the parties have been Christian democratic in nature, centrist in nature, consistently supporting the rule of law, consistently supporting improvements in the rule of law, consistently investing, for example, in education when they made that policy decision in the 60s, consistently seeking to open Ireland up to the world from the 1970s. Consistently seeking to attract foreign direct investment as a means of generating employment from the 1960s on. So I would say the policy direction has been very consistent, which I talk about as benefiting us in terms of institutional capital. So to your very point, I think the development of institutions of state, we have been fortunate to have a moderate policy direction that has built up institutions of state, and which then we learned so much from joining the European Union, because of course Ireland is relatively small, 5 million population. So joining the European Union gave us so much additional insight in terms of best practice from elsewhere in Europe. And of course, the majority of our, I wouldn't say the majority, but a very significant amount of our law today comes from the European Union. And generally speaking, that is well tried and tested by the time it reaches us, and has helped us build on that stability, which of course, again, ties into attracting foreign direct investment, because of course, being good implementers of that European law, being a good EU citizen is what attracts that foreign investment, allowing us to create that employment, allowing us to have the economic resources that can then be redistributed to reduce inequality, for example.
And has influence also in that economic development the fact that that United Kingdom has left the EU?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I kind of make the case, as I referred to earlier, that really over 100 years, it has really been a story of gradually disentangling ourselves from the United Kingdom, but we didn't succeed much in the first 50 years. Again, lots of evidence in the book in terms of exports or tourism. The first 50 years, as in from up 1920s up to 1970s, this economy was still completely reliant on Great Britain and the United Kingdom for everything, really. It was only when we joined the EU and then that opened up the economic potential to trade much wider that we really then began to see the economic benefit. That has begun a process of gradually disentangling ourselves from the UK. And the book isn't, only because I suppose over the 100 years, it was about a story of independence from the United Kingdom. I periodically in the book touch on the fact about how we are above the UK on many well-being indicators these days, on a whole variety of things. I mean, I touched on it here in GDP terms, but it pervades the book in different areas, from everything from media freedom to education level. We're now exceeding the UK. We're up there now with the Nordic countries. And so I end the book with a plea to readers to reframe our thinking and just look over the big island next to us, to think about positioning ourselves and comparing ourselves and learning from the Nordic countries in terms of their success, because by any global comparative table, that's the peer group that we're in now.
Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you. We've run a bit over, Jill, but hey,
a little bit over,
questions.
that's okay. Great presentation. Obviously, this stimulated a lot of great discussion as well. So yeah, as we're over the hour timeline, I think we have to stop it there, but very thrilled to have you, Mark. Thank you so much for a lovely presentation, and I look forward to actually getting your book and reading through that further, and hopefully you'll have lots of other details to maybe do a follow-up book in the post-pandemic era. I'm sure there's things that for your future research to consider as well.
Absolutely. And look, anyone who's any bills or any ideas or any suggestions or any critiques, yeah, feel free to email me. The address is in the presentation, or get the book, it's in there too. And thoughts welcome. markhenry.ie if you want to read more, find my contact details there.
Perfect. And as a note, we'll also be sending everyone an email after this with a link to the recording in case you came in late. Also, if you're not a member, we'll be sending you a special discount option for a three-month membership trial, free, just by participating today. And if you are also interested in quality of life studies, we encourage you to consider joining us at our upcoming conference this coming August in Vermont. And all those details will be in that upcoming email. thank you, Mark, again. And we really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll be in touch and hear from you in the future.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all, everyone, for wherever you are. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Bye, all. Bye, Mark. Thank you.